Now, again, okay. Thank you very much. So in the Ukraine, the Global Ecovillage Network Ukraine actually organized a project which is called the Green Road. In this Green Road, eco-villages, like on not where the military actions are, accommodate people from all over the Ukraine in order that they are safe because they lost their houses or because of military actions in their regions. So the people staying in summer houses or in the community member houses, and in one eco-village, which is a bit far away from the military action, they need to build winter housing for these people. So on the Gen conference, we just recently were participating, they made up a project which is in line with Gen to support the Ukraine in this regard. So we are supporting an eco-village to build up a common house, winter housing for people from the Ukraine to stay there in a safe place. I will build up a table over there with products from the Ukraine, an information sheet about that project, and a list where you can write down your name, your email address, and what you're willing to donate. The winter housing has to be built between August and October. So it's quite a short term. It will be a strollball house, and we need like 250,000 euro. On the Gen conference, within one day, we organized 8,000 euro so far. And actually some people were willing to guarantee 50,000 euro or more in order that the construction work can start. So just in case, you can either donor, it can be like 100 euro or less, or guarantee for a certain amount for a year. You can come to me or to that list. I will build up a table over there and write down your name. You can also get more information during the time because I think more support will be required during the time. Thank you very much.
Okay. Can you all hear me? Nice. Welcome. This is the Plenary International Communities and COVID. It is the part 1 of 2 plenaries on the same topic. And just to let you know that we had a small change. So we will have 4 people presenting in this session, and we are going from now until 11:15. It will be a bit longer, but we'll still have 15 minutes break to get to the next one. Okay? So I'm Taisa Mattos from Brazil. I'm co-chair of ICSA and also Gen Research and Education Coordinator. And I'll be here facilitating this session with amazing people around. So I'm happy to welcome Cynthia. She's a co-director of the Foundation for Intentional Communities and also a community matchmaker. Cynthia will present about intentional communities and COVID. Maybe you can just wave your hand. And I think I will introduce all of you. Aaron Lavi from Israel is the founder and director of Hakel Network of Intentional Communities. We also have on stage Laurie Weeks from Canada. She's a professor at Dalhousie University. You're very welcome. She's a social scientist and gerontologist. And her topic is the best place to be, experiences of older adults living in Canadian co-housing communities during the COVID pandemic. And I'm very glad to welcome Beatriz, Arruda, and Bruna Bevilacqua from Brazil. They are both part of the Brazilian Ecovillage Research Circle. Beatriz is an urban designer and architect. She's our operational leader of Casa Brasil Research. And she's doing her PhD at Unicamp. And Bruna is she's an engineer, studying environmental education and doing her master's on FUHG. And this paper was also co-created by Rebeca Roysen, that is now at the University of Basel, but couldn't join us in person. Okay, we'll start with Cynthia. Welcome.
Hey, can you hear me? Is the mic working? Awesome. All right, so I have a presentation and I'm going to stand up so I can see the presentation while I'm talking. Ah, there we go. Beautiful. All right, so good morning, everyone. Once again, my name is Cynthia, and we are camping during the conference. And last night was a very cold night, so I woke up with a bit of a sore throat. So bear with me if I lose my voice or need to drink some of my tea. But I'm very happy to be here and to share with you about some research that we did over 2020 and 2021 regarding how intentional communities were responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. So this lovely photo is from Terra Nueva Cohousing in California. And you can see the photos, some people have masks, some people don't have masks, some people are like sitting in their little pod. I think this is a photo that's very indicative of the experience that many intentional communities went through this crisis of different people having different reactions to it, making their own choices, maybe sometimes the community making group choices. I think the big thing I want to impress on all of you is just how varied the responses were and how, in many cases, this created a lot of tension. As it did in wider society, so true in intentional communities. So let's see if my clicker works. Yeah. All right, answering the call. We had an aim as the Foundation for Intentional Community, which is a nonprofit organization based in the United States. We had an aim to really document this historic moment, to document what was happening in the lives of people who lived in intentional community and how that may have been different or similar to the experiences of people who were not living in intentional community. And we wanted to try to assess this on a global scale, how people in different regions, urban, rural, how they were responding. And I have to say, what really kicked this off for us was Anton, who we have in this room. And I'll share this next slide. So Anton reached out in, I think it was May 2020, when we were really in the throes of this crisis. And he reached out on behalf of the Intentional Communities Desk, saying, hey, you know, these organizations we're connected to are doing some surveys. We're doing a survey. Would FIC, the Foundation for Intentional Community, be interested in sending out a survey? And I was kind of like, yes, like this is really important to respond to this moment and try to document what is happening. So I put a link there. I shortened it to a bit.ly link. If you're curious, you can go to that website. It'll bring you to the Intentional Communities Desk website, where there is a report. I think you had like 250 communities, a lot of responses. And so really great information there if you're curious. So that study is from May and June 2020. And then this inspired us the next year in 2021 to do a follow-up study. So this is a time when we'd gone through maybe the worst days of COVID and we were beginning to open up, and we wanted to see how communities at that stage of the pandemic were responding. And we created this lovely report, which is available online. I'll share the link with you at the end of the presentation. Really would encourage you to go through it. It's quite large. We also link to the original data that we got from the survey. And today I'm just going to go through a few of the highlights, some insights that I think are important to bring into this conference for general awareness. I'm sure where I should point the, there we go, okay. All right, so here is the rough timeline of this project. We began in spring 2021. This is when vaccines were beginning to be rolled out. There were opening up measures in place in various parts of the world. And at this time, many communitarians and also research organizations were contacting us with questions. How are communities responding? And at this time, we are also noticing and continue to notice an increase of interest in intentional communities. It seemed from my anecdotal impressions that as people went through this very stressful experience of being isolated, alone, or with their nuclear family, that they were opening their minds up to communal living and kind of looking at that afresh and looking around to see what ecovillages or co-housings existed out there and how they may join or start one. So in April, we sent out this survey to, oh, I have an echo. That's fun. Testing, okay, it's good. So in April, we sent out this survey. You can see the original survey at ic.org/ic-covid-survey. And by May, we had around 58 communities who had responded. So a lot fewer than that initial survey, but also ours was, I would say, more extensive in terms of the questions that we asked. And some communities were quite lengthy in their responses. And then in June, we were able to share this report with the public. So as I mentioned, 58 communities responded. I'll share a little bit about the demographics. We had respondents from 12 countries, although the majority were in the United States. Most of the community These were over 10 years, so these were relatively few communities that were just forming. Half were in a rural location, and then the other half was either in a city or the suburbs. And most of the communities also had more than 50 residents. So again, mostly sizable communities, although we had some. Okay, so 10 key insights that I want to share with you that came out of this research project. And I'll also mention that I'm not an academic. This was like something that I felt was important to do, and we collaborated with our small nonprofit team at FIC to make happen. So I would really encourage the academics out there to build upon this research and take it further and do what you do, maybe better than I do. All right, so starting off, as I had mentioned earlier, many of these communities that we surveyed experienced a lot of stress. They shared with us that this was a really difficult time. They experienced some conflict within their community regarding how to respond to what was happening. And I'm going to share with you throughout this presentation a lot of quotes. I won't read them all verbatim, but you can read them yourself and get a sense, some impression for what this experience was like for many of the communities in our network. So for example, the Nabusset neighborhood and farm community in New Hampshire in the United States shared with us that a few of the people in their community have been so burned over this conflict that they have entirely withdrawn, and one is considering leaving. So this was something that we noticed that in many cases, or some cases, residents would actually end up leaving the community over these conflicts. This has been one of, if not the hardest things we've had to navigate in my 9 years here. That was from Lost Valley community in Oregon. We're all weary. We'd hoped this would be over by now. This first quote I find very interesting because this is someone sharing how the COVID experience has been difficult, and also opening up has been difficult. And this is regarding the vaccinations, where the president of the community requested that all of the community residents share with them anonymously what their vaccination status was, and then that the president would share that with that community for general information. And some residents were very resistant to that, and that created a lot of conflict in their community. Opinions are very polarizing. Everything from COVID does not exist, it's all a lie, to we have to protect each other and do everything that the government says. So friendships were broken, just really difficult stuff that happened. We noticed that in the study that it seemed to be that the more highly communal and urban communities experienced more stress than the communities that had more spaciousness. Maybe they were in the countryside, maybe they had individual residencies. And that makes sense, right? Because the people who are sharing a kitchen and a bathroom together, they have to be maybe extra cautious with their precautions. So Twin Oaks community, for example, this is a pretty communal kind of living situation. And they say that they had to be generally more careful, perhaps, than if they were living by themselves. Other communities said that it's been fairly easy since they live on 5 acres with freestanding homes and with their own laundry facilities. And we also noticed, so this community in Mexico is a good example. They say, we have one of the best climates in the world. So this has helped. No one's been stuck indoors. So again, those communities that maybe are in a warmer climate, they had an easier time. We also noticed that a number of communities said that they were really glad to be living in community during this crisis, that they felt that their lives were perhaps better off than people who were not living communally. For example, from Twin Oaks, they said that more or less our lives were 85% the same as before the pandemic and 15% different. Whereas for many people, their lives were 85% different and 15% the same as pre-pandemic. So maybe something about the support or the stability, the resiliency that community living can provide enabled them to do that. A lot of gratitude for each other in our beautiful land. We've not been as isolated as so many people. We also noticed, which is very touching, residents sharing that they were supporting each other in a variety of ways through this crisis. So especially younger people helping older people get groceries, get supplies as needed. And we did notice that the majority of communities went into some form of lockdown, and at the time of this study, they were beginning to open up. So I'll share here from a community in Australia that as things got better, we reopened our community building for residents and now for visitors. Divergent views, though, did make it hard at times. The communities recently returned to in-person meetings with no precautions because all residents are fully vaccinated. We were really impressed that early on, a lot of communities were able to organize and mobilize themselves quickly. They created task force, they created their own internal community guidelines or policies. So maybe this is quite different than the experience of someone living in the mainstream, not living communally, where it's kind of each household on their own. These communities, because they were already organized, were able to form group decisions and as a whole neighborhood decide how they want to respond together. And we noticed how, for example, in this case of Wild Sage Cohousing in Boulder, where they created pods within their community, this enabled people to still interact with each other and feel more safe doing so. You can see here a graph that shows the general response to COVID, with around half saying that we've been very cautious and follow all health guidelines. So that's about half of the communities. But then from there, it varies with maybe the second majority. We've mostly followed the health guidelines with some leniency, all the way to, we openly disagree with the guidelines and want to be a refuge for people who share our thinking. So really a huge variety of responses, and I'll share more about that shortly. Yeah, so another example of a community that created a mutual aid task force to discuss the state guidelines and then make recommendations for the community. So you see, it's like there's the government guidelines, and then the community uses its own filter, its own processes and groups to interpret that information and then help the community make decisions from there. So it's very interesting. Some communities closed completely, and some pivoted to online membership interviews, virtual tours, and events. So this is also drawing from my work as a community matchmaker, supporting people who want to join intentional communities. There was a while where no one could travel to go visit these communities. And so how do you get to know a place? How do you still, go on a tour or engage in the membership process? And a lot of that happened online. And I have to say, some communities are continuing with that, offering, coffee hours online for prospective residents to get to know the community, offering virtual tours and the like. Okay, so we meet as a community virtually, although smaller meetings under 10 people, then we can sometimes meet outside depending on the weather. Masks must be worn and social distancing practice. This is from Pacific Gardens Cohousing community in Canada. You can see here that it was roughly equal proportionally in terms of the survey respondents for those that shifted to hosting all of their community meetings virtually versus hosting meetings in person with precautions, or saying that their meeting habits simply haven't changed at all. Later on, some residents said that they experienced an increase of interest in their community. Certainly, as the Foundation for Intentional Community, we experienced throughout the pandemic, I would say it's waning a little bit now, but a huge interest in this movement, more media reaching out, asking to learn more publications, more website traffic. So it's been an interesting time for us as a movement to be going through a crisis in which community can be a strong antidote to some of the loneliness that people were experiencing, and many still are. Okay, so now we get into maybe some of the more I don't know how to say, interesting aspects in terms of I myself being surprised by the results, just how different some of the responses were in the different communities. Especially as an organization, we are, I would say, coming more from a progressive or left background. We're very mindful of government guidelines as an organization, but then seeing how we have some communities in our network across the spectrum. So this was very interesting and kind of eye-opening for us. For example, we had a community in Colombia that shared that they feel violently angry with what is being done to the world and to people's minds, most especially the censorship of all alternative views, medical knowledge, So we had that on one side perhaps, and then on the other side, a community in Missouri. We have followed all recommended procedures when out in public, and we will continue to do so. So very, very interesting, that difference. Here you can see at the time of this survey, how people were responding to vaccination. About 80% said that they have no requirements for having their residents be vaccinated. And then a much smaller percentage saying that, like 8%, we require members and residents to get vaccinated. 10% we require members to disclose their vaccination status. And I'm wondering how this has changed at this stage in the pandemic now that vaccines are more widely available. Yeah, did I skip a slide? No, okay, yeah, so this is continuing with the same theme of just how diverse these views were. And some communities that internally were recognizing the diversity of views. For example, Calabos de las Estrellas community in New Mexico in the US. We do not censor our library or our bulletin boards. Diverse opinions and information are welcome. We consider well-informed residents considering different views as a huge plus for our community. You can read those. And meanwhile, some communities found that they were relatively all on board with a similar view. So they experienced maybe little difficulty in finding group alignment or enforcing their policies. For example, a community in Poland shared with us that they meet regularly to assess COVID issues. All decisions on policy and adjustments are made as a whole. Everyone's voice is heard, honored, and considered. Our COVID policies have not been difficult to enforce, as all understood by experience the consequences of not doing so. This is from Oasis Gardens and Learning Center, where they shared with us that they had had a number of COVID cases in their community. And afterwards, everyone was kind of on board with their requirements. And I like this one from Wow Wild Women Community in Seattle. We talk and laugh about it amongst ourselves. And this is the last two quotes that I'll leave you with. And I think these two really emphasize this wide spectrum of opinion on this topic. We have this community in Arizona that shared with us that their residents are highly educated. Everyone sets their own policy. They view that the hype about COVID is that all these restrictions are the government's way to destroy individuality, middle class, get everyone dependent on government handouts. So in their view, this is highly educated. And then we had another community use that same term, but they have a very different view of what that means. We have several college professors and fairly well-educated residents. So the community has been very proactive in keeping current with scientific and medical information. We've even published articles through email throughout the pandemic. So for us, from myself personally, and also as an organization, to hold space for all of this and to show that community living and intentional communities is an idea and a concept that people from all walks of life are attracted to. You know, people want at the core very similar things. They want their kids to grow up in a healthy environment. They want to know their neighbors. They want to feel safe and supported. And they may have different ideas about how to get there. And so as an organization, we've been thinking a lot about how to hold space for conversation, for dialogue, and letting this be a learning experience for all of us. Okay. All right, you can see the full report at ic.org/COVID-report. Really encourage you to go there. You'll also find the, like I shared, the raw data. And we would love for more research to happen. I think our friends in Brazil said that they were inspired by this study to do their own survey, and we would love to see more of that. We would love if any of you want to pick up this baton and pull out different insights from the survey data we have, or do your own surveys. We'd be happy to share those with our network. And thank you so much to the communities that participated and were vulnerable and open with us about their experiences. And thank you all for listening.
I think we can hear from Beatriz and Bruna now, because I know the study is completely related, and then we open the mic. I will start with them. You are the next. Yeah, great.
Oh, I won't need this. Thank you, though. I'm going to share the slides in Zoom directly.
Yeah,
Okay.
but you can use to change the slides.
Oh, really? Oh.
No. Okay. So you can do direct. 1 and 4. And then we open for questions.
Esse negócio vai ficar aqui.
Não, peraí. Não clique em stop share. Aqui. Lá não está aparecendo. Isso é só se ele tem. Não aparece lá, não te preocupe.
Oh, mas vai ficar aqui na frente. Good morning. Is everyone listening to my voice?
And me? Okay.
Okay, hello. We are honored and very happy to be here to talk about the response and adaptation to COVID-19 pandemic in Brazilian ecovillages. We are going to talk a little bit about us, the context of the pandemic in Brazil, our quest, goal, and justification. We will provide a research timeline also, where we are going to talk about methodology. The detailed procedures, we'll go by them very fast. If one wants to see them with more time, we can maybe share the slides, and then we will discuss the results and provide some conclusions that came up. So I'm Beatriz, this is Bruna, and unfortunately, Dr. Rebeca couldn't be with us today. She's in Brazil. She's a member of the IBC, which is an NGO and an eco-village about 230 kilometers from the federal district, Brasilia. And it's a pity that she couldn't be with us because she's there, it's 5 a.m. in the morning.
So this research was conducted within the Casa Brasil Research Circle, which we are part of. Casa Brasil is one of the national networks of Casa Latina. That's the arm of GEN in Latin America.
And when the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as a worldwide endemic, so a pandemic, Brazil followed, and this situation remained until last April. The current situation is of 33 million registered cases. That's over 15% of Brazilian population, which is now estimated to be around 215,000 million people. And unfortunately, we had over almost 700,000 deaths, although the immunization rate is reaching almost 80% of the population.
And in this context emerged the following research question. To what extent does this disruptive situation alter or strengthen the organizational structure and social, cultural, economic, and ecosystem processes in intentional communities that identify themselves as ecovillages in Brazil?
And our goal then was to know how Brazilian ecovillages emergently responded to the COVID-19 pandemic and how they have since dealt with the risks and effects caused by the multiple crises that were deepened by this pandemic.
And we justify this study because as volunteers of Casa Brasil Research Circle Network, and also researchers, we wanted to provide an overview of ecovillages in a large portion of the South American continent, that is Brazil. And the pioneering work, intentional communities in COVID that Cynthia just shared with us was an inspiration. The possibilities to establish comparisons in the future of sharing with the Brazilian communities and also broadly among regions and countries through other national networks linked to Casa Latina and GEN.
So it made sense for us to replicate the methodology, of course, with adaptations and also with new questions that we had to elaborate to fit in our specific context. And this elaboration, we worked on it for about 2 months, and we relied on our research circle for discussions, in which also Taisa was there to help give her opinion. Then we spent about 4 months collecting data through an online survey. We had the abstract approved by the ICSA on December, and since then we've been saving for being here. And also the treatment and analysis of this data, we took about 2 months, and then we started writing the scientific report. And also we've translated the survey to Spanish. So after this presentation, we will move on to the Casa Latina gathering, where we are going to share this results in Portuguese, Spanish, and also invite all Latin American ecovillages to give us, to participate and give us their views about what happened. So about methodology, we've already been through this. I'm going to talk more about the structure. We divided the survey in 3 sessions. We are not going to share details about the respondents or name of the communities. We are going to preserve their identities, but we will see in deep how the COVID was in these places. We had 10 multiple questions and 8 open questions in interview style. And we called for participation in 2 different ways. First, we approached ecovillages with email, but then we also use the social media, and besides posting flyers inviting ecovillages, we also had a live that was a conversation about ecovillages in pandemic times, where the public announcement of the research was made and the invitation also. So here you can see the flyers of the event at the orange one, and the green one was the formal invitation.
Now moving on to the results, let's start with the community's characterization. So 12 communities, ecovillages in Brazil, answered our survey, and 9 of them are consolidated ecovillages considering Casas Brasil database, because they have 5 or more years of existence, and 3 of the respondent ones were in planning phase. So from now on, we'll only talk about those 9 ones that were already people who were living together, and not the ones in planning phase. mapping them, we found out that we had at least one answer of each geographical region of Brazil. So they are illustrative sample. And you can see here, I don't know how it shows for you. Yeah, but the yellow dots are all ecovillages in Brazil registered in the network. The orange big ones are the ones we are going to share the results now, and the blue ones are the ones in planning phase.
So about years of existence, it's interesting to notice that we have some young communities, but 4 out of 9 have 31 or more years of existence. So they are mature communities. Also about size, half of them were pretty small with under 60 residents, but the other half had from 100 to 700 residents. So we consider them from medium to big size communities. And location differs a little bit of FICs, sorry, because all Brazilian ecovillages that responded to this call are rural ecovillages. Some of them are remote, that means they're far from the urban area, and others are peri-urban, that's close to urban area. And most of them has a mixture of private and shared spaces. Only 2 share all the spaces. And of course, it wasn't a surprise that none of them answered they only had private spaces. Of course, they're communities, right? Well, specifically about COVID-19, did they have residents who were infected? Most of them answered yes, unfortunately. Only 1 answered no, and 2 didn't inform us about this. But the general response was that 7 out of 2 tried to follow World Health Organization orientations totally or partially.
And differs from FIC's results that none of the Brazilian communities disagreed with the orientations of the World Health Organization and tried to be a refugee for people who didn't agree with them.
And this shows the same information as before. It doesn't lead us to any conclusion about the difference between remote or peri-urban in this aspect. Another interesting difference is that all of them, in some level, requested use of masks. And also about social distancing, most of them, the majority also had some requirements about it. Only 1 ecovillage reported not having changed anything about social interaction. And about the meetings, most of them decided to have both in-person and virtual meetings. Only 1 of them changed completely to the online socializing environment, and only 1 decided to host only in-person meetings, but taking some sanitary precautions. About vaccination, in Brazil, this isn't really an issue. All of them, in some level, had consensus about getting vaccinated. Of course, 5 out of 9 left this to an individual or family level of decision, but there was no answer about being against getting vaccinated.
So about the visitation during the pandemic, before the pandemic, they reported receiving on average 400 visitors per year. And during the pandemic, more than half of them were accepting visitors with precaution, 1 with no precautions, and a third of them closed totally for visitation with reopening perspective when they answered this in the end of 2021.
But there were some changes in resident populations. The same proportion of increase and decrease was reported. And there was an increase in outsiders looking for the community to get to know it and for even moving in.
Reported by almost all of them.
Yeah. And where did the communities get information for their decision-making processes? So they told us, it's a quote, the World Health Organization, the Health Ministry of Brazil, and other websites like press that was national and international, social media. But the most interesting is that if we cross cross data, there is a tendency that the biggest the community is, the less collective the decision-making processes concerning the pandemics were. So we are going now to see some things with their own words, a little bit adapted to
Because of the translation.
Yeah.
So
About economic aspects, there were negative effects in their income sources because courses, retreats, and other experiences have to be temporarily interrupted. So it resulted in reduced or no visitations at all for some time. And there was also the closure of the schools in the communities that have one, and also reduced sales of products that Ecovillage used to exchange. So on one hand, one told us that there was a greater isolation, a job difficulty from the Ecovillages to assess their jobs outside, and also for people hired from the Ecovillage to work in there, also had difficulties in accessing the place. While on the other hand, there was a community that said, after all, it improved.
and one eco-village reported that urban refugees joined, that's how they call them, urban refugees, bought houses and started emphasizing home office and online jobs.
So in terms of connection with space, this last quote is related to the second dot here in the bottom left, when they say that one had less interest and efforts in planting, building, and living simple, because they were not really into the glue that is first established the Ecovillage, we perceive. And on the other hand, other communities reported that there was more interest in agriculture. So we had
the people that already lived there before the pandemic.
Yeah.
But for the newcomers, it was a different reaction.
And about the connection within the community, there were some internal questions that had to be resoluted. And also there were support campaigns for those who were struggling more than others. And also the connection with the surroundings and beyond. There was great sadness and disillusionment with the Brazilian government. And as the numbers show, you may perceive that politics wasn't really coordinating the things around it. But eco-villages, they organized themselves to give support for the external environment with campaigns to collect emergency resources, to give permanent donations, create new programs. And also they started offering distance education courses and also new social environmental projects. And about living in community during pandemic, there are advantages, right, Bruna?
So they said that the natural setting isolation facilitated the sanitary security.
It favored more introspection because going less out, there were more internal production and less shopping.
They found a support network, affection maintenance, contact, eating healthy.
So many people turned to the land, planting and eating what they were eating at the site.
They expressed a strengthen on their belief in a more alternative lifestyle.
And also, because they are in a rural area, they reported that the infection rates were low in their regions, so they felt safer. But there are also some disadvantages, especially concerning losses in the qualitative the quality of the interactions of living together, because they had to make sudden change of plans and there were many difficulties to adapt to the new reality.
And what about the challenges of living in community during pandemic?
With or without pandemics, it seems that human relations are the biggest challenge. And learning to live, to really live more isolated than they were already before in the case of the remote communities was something that was said many times. Also,
They said that there is no intentional community that can resist the real estate speculation and the rich newcomers whose habits and interests are disconnected to true sustainability.
And they had to deal with more work for more people because many of them became unemployed. And
Once again, they expressed their disillusionment with the Brazilian government hearing the challenges of facing the pandemic.
Yeah, there was a lot of critique about that. But there were also lessons learned. So the communities kept going, and all those human relations improvements, they rely on cooperation, on understanding, on self-management improvements, and also in nonviolent communication. And in this way, many communities found their ways for subsisting with planting what they are eating, to taking more care about the land together with themselves and their families. So they studied a lot. They practiced agriculture together because they were looking for the self-sufficiency. And they realized we have to vote better. Next time, this year, we have the chance to do that. And
so how to develop resilience to face other possible pandemics in the future?
That may come, and to be self-sustainable, there is a lot to do about taking responsibility, self-managing themselves, and with consciousness that go from spiritual practices to relying on science information. Also concerning environmental conservation through regeneration programs, through agroecology practices, that plant their food together with the natural cycles of the region, and that is strengthening the communitary economy, generating internal income, not only by selling and these products, by lessening consumption from the outside, but also making a digital presence, offering courses and other kinds of experiences online.
And what we found interesting in analyzing their answers to resilience development is that we can connect all their answers to the 4 dimensions of sustainability of the Ecovillage approach.
As the Ecovillage design education courses has taught and inspired many of these communities and us as well.
Just sadly, one community said there's nothing they're going to do to develop resilience because the communitarian web was dismounting itself. So the community was over because of the pandemic.
Yes. So now let's go to some of the conclusions here. We are going to summarize some things that we've already discussed during the presentation. About 10% of the Casa Brasil network database were responding to this research. So there is not sufficient data to say that it's representative of the Brazilian movement as a whole, but it gives us a good illustration about it because it was very diverse, not only geographically, but in sizes, in times of existence, and of course, because of their geographical dispersion about some cultural aspects also. And it's worth mentioning that the answers provided by only one member of each community may not reflect the opinions of the whole, but especially in the biggest ones. So the sample difference regarding FIC's research is that in Brazil, only the rural communities participated. And most of them followed partially or totally the orientations from the World Health organization. A third of them closed for visitation, while half of them continue receiving visitors, but saying that there were precautions. And the resident populations increased and decreased in the same proportion. The number of people interested in getting to know our living communities increased generally. And regarding the pandemic, the bigger the communities are, the less the collective decision-making processes tend to be. Well, about the social economical impacts, there were many reflections in those concerning the Brazilian political institutional context, the importance of science, the healthy eating habits that could develop from that time on, the quality of social conviviality and cooperation among residents, and internal and external solidarity, supporting those less fortunate. And there were reactions that strengthened the groups that could adapt with new actions taken in many ways, but also discharacterization or discontinuity of some communities. One community is now over. So
and another was discharacterized by these urban refugees newcomers. So in finishing our conclusions, summing them up, being community doesn't imply being alienated to the regional and national contexts, because they are not islands, even if they are remote. So they are affected by what's happening on the outside.
And rural locations generally favored social distancing, slowing down or preventing the arrival of the virus. And this allowed more direct and profound contact with the land and the local production of food.
And in the end, living in community can facilitate as well as complicate how to deal with the effects of a pandemic.
So here are some references of this presentation. And we acknowledge their contribution in participating, not only the respondents, but the communities they are from consenting to this. We also thank Casa Brasil and our friends in the research circle, and of course, Rebeca, who was guiding us through the processes. And if you want to make suggestions, comments, or even connect with us for collaboration, here is our email. We will be glad to get a message from you. Thank you very much.
Beatriz, just to bring some energy in. If we have any questions here, okay. And also, the mic is not working.
Okay. I found it interesting, the reaction in Brazil to the US. You know, like in Brazil, there was, you know, in the beginning of the pandemic, there was a very poor response from the government. And, you know, the people in the community seemed to go more by the World Health Organization. And, you know, they complied with a lot of the recommendations from there. But in the US, there was a sort of, you know, seemed to be a reaction then to, you know, the state sort of saying what we should be doing. So do you think it was to do with the government response that there was the different response from in the two countries?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm not so familiar with how it was in Brazil, with how the government responded. I would, though, mention, I believe, one of the survey respondents who was very vocal about going their own way and being anti-government. They were from Colombia. I don't know if that was an expat community. I don't know the makeup of that community. But yeah, certainly we saw there were some very strong reactions from some communities in the US One difference I noted, you quoted the World Health Organization, and maybe the participants even mentioned that organization in their survey. None of our respondents mentioned WHO. So, yeah. What do you?
If I may add to that, Brazil didn't really have a federal coordination program or a strategy to deal with the virus. So the communities really had to rely on themselves. And at the municipal level, things were very different from one city or town to another. So vaccination was something that also took a long time to start, and people were waiting for it. So they were really precautious and solidary to their neighbors and within the communities, because there was a lot of struggle. The economic crisis that came with the COVID pandemic was also very challenging.
Okay, let's just open for one online participant, and then we hand it over to Dan.
So I don't, I was a little bit delayed in asking the online folks if they had questions, because I myself had a question.
So let's go for your question.
At this point, I'm not seeing any hands online, so I will ask my own. So this is kind of a question, I guess, for further research. And again, as with Vincent, in terms of the discrepancy with the Brazilian community seemingly being more willing to follow standard health guidelines, I wonder if this could also be a function of the scope or trust of the two sponsoring organizations. You know, might it be that FIC has some members, even though, Cynthia, you characterize the FIC attitude as fairly compliant with public health, that FIC as a kind of long-standing group with a very widely used directory may have some members that are more divergent, and CASA may be a more kind of ideologically cohesive group. Just something to test as you do further surveys.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I wonder how we would test for that. And maybe it's just that I'm not an academic, but maybe some of you have ideas, and we'd really, again, encourage that further research.
Great. So we'll hear one last question for now, then we will continue with the presentations, and we will open for more questions at the end. Aaron.
One between question and comment. If you were listened yesterday to Sigal's lecture about the kibbutz movement and the environment, and she ended with the reaction to the pandemic, and Doron Timor talk about it, about intentional communities in Israel and the pandemic. So we see a different. I was, Cynthia, really surprised to hear your talk regarding the central point was how you react to the situation, and how to what extent you agree or disagree with the government regarding that, and we heard somewhat regarding the Brazilian intentional communities. Well, we found, especially the situation is the situation, and let's see how common community, communal community like kibbutz or intentional communities Israel deal with this situation, how we fix on, how we use our mutual responsibility to deal with it better than other places, how our being, the fact that we are isolated, we are in the, we are around in, you know, not in the midtown, so it's not an urban place, it's a farm, more in farm, so we're more isolated, we can deal with it better, we have the mutual responsibility. So it's really interesting why in our place, in our country, the situation was, okay, this is the situation, how we deal with it better because of our mutual responsibility. And you telling us about situation that the first question is, okay, do we agree or disagree with the situation, with the instructions? It was very interesting to me. Maybe you can say another word about it or explain it, or can understand it. It's different. I mean.
I can say that we will have another presentation related to Israel. So maybe very soon there will be more information, but I don't know if someone from here would like to add something.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to learning more about the Israeli response. I would just emphasize it was not we asked many questions, and this was an aspect of one question that we asked regarding the diversity of responses. And I think we asked that question in part because we already perceived that this was a reaction from many events and other research we had done prior to that. So.
Okay.
Okay. I'm just talking about the political polarity that's taking place in Brazil for the last 4 years. The Brazilian president right now is a person that empowers people that express themselves in very violent ways, misogynist ways, homophobic ways. He's a rude person. So this kind of character is the one that was doubting science data, that was spreading fake news about COVID and other things that really don't have nothing to do with the spirit of Ecovillage movement, which is about peace, love, and caring about each other and the earth. So this agreement to the politics in our country and this coordination that had to be made by themselves, not relying on the government decisions so much, I think it has to do with this broader environment. That's why we said the Ecovillage is not an island, not only physically, but in ideology helms.
Okay. Thank you. I think we can continue this conversation very soon, but now I will invite Laurie to present, and then Aaron, and we open for more questions at the end.
Okay, I'm number 3. Am I on? Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm screen sharing. Is that okay? Okay.
Just a sec. Okay, that's fine. Great. Now we are ready.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so I'm Lori Weeks. Thank you. It's lovely to be part of a panel of complementary presentations. So whoever put these together did a great job. It's also such a lovely continuation, I think, of what Kirsten Stevens Wood talked about yesterday, if you were able to attend her panel on intentional communities and the UK response in particular. She did such a nice background of issues about aging and in intentional communities. So I've never been at a conference where so many people asked me how I live or where I live. So I thought I can explain a little bit about that. So I thought I'd just show you a couple pictures. So I don't live in an intentional community. I live in a community though. I'm from a very rural place. I had a lovely summer picture. Then I thought, no, I live in Canada. I'm going to show you what it looks like for about 4 or 5 months of the year. So this was after a very large snowstorm. I took some pictures. I had to dig out of my garage and throw the snow above my head to get out of the house. It was quite exciting. So that's my home in rural Prince Edward Island, but we have a lovely garden. We grow lots of food. There's lots of months of the year that are not looking like the first picture. We have solar panels and generate enough electricity for our purposes for the full year, and we have an electric car. But I also have a home in the city because where I work now is in Halifax in Nova Scotia, which is several hours away. So I have a condo in the city, which I haven't been able to see for a few years because I haven't needed to be in the city. I've been working remotely, and I've been able to rent it. But it's a lovely LEED platinum building with all kinds of really cool features like rainwater collection and heat pumps for all the heat and such things. So that's how I live. But I do live in a community where there's a lot of mutual support and interaction from friends and neighbors, certainly when I live on Prince Edward Island. So our research team, our Canadian Cohousing research team, is made up of a variety of people, including many who do live in intentional communities. Some of you might remember Margaret Critchlow. A few of you asked me if I know her. She was part of our team, and she was at this conference when it was in Norway. I think it was 9 years ago. No, not Norway, Scotland, when it was in Scotland 9 years ago. And she really encouraged me to come and be at this conference and meet all the lovely people and learn about other intentional communities in the world. And we have a few other people in co-housing communities, and Catherine Harmon is actually part of one that's just forming. But not just forming, it's actually imminent that will open this fall, which is exciting. And the rest of our team is made up of researchers across Canada, many in the region that I'm from, but also some in other parts of the country as well. So just a little geography. I'm sure you all know where Canada is. It occupies the top part of North America, made up of 10 provinces spanning from the Pacific to the Atlantic, and 3 territories in the north. And I've circled the part that I'm from, a little part of East. When people ask me where I'm from, I often say Eastern Canada. So these are 3 small provinces in the eastern part of the country. There's also Newfoundland and Labrador, which if you add those, we call them Atlantic Canada. But if it's just the 3, we say the Maritime provinces. So my little part of the world are these 3 provinces. I'm from this one, a tiny island of about 140,000 people. The others are Nova Scotia. So I actually, my job when I have to be there physically and don't work remotely is in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And the other province here is New Brunswick. So what do we know about this part of the world? Some of you might have heard of Anne of Green Gables. I usually get a reaction about that one. So she's not real. She is a fictional character, but she seems real. And the author was from Prince Edward Island. And she really, I think, put our island on the map. And a lot of people come to do kind of the Anne pilgrimage and go to all the sites and everything, of which there are real ones and fictional ones on our island. It's also a very agricultural place. It's called the Million Acre Farm in a lot of ways. We grow a lot of potatoes, probably too many potatoes, but lots of other things as well. And fishing as well is an important part of us. We also have summer and we have lovely beaches and very swimmable beaches. The water is actually relatively warm in the summer, relatively shallow. So lovely beaches. And this is the bridge. They built a bridge to connect our little island to the rest of the world. So all the tourists can come and all the products can leave and things like that. And I can drive easily to Halifax. It's the largest bridge covering ice-covered waters in the world. So in the wintertime, this is frozen water and tidal. So it's quite technical to build a bridge over that much water. So a lot of people come and look at the bridge, which is kind of fun. It takes about 11 minutes to drive across the bridge. It's quite large. And it's been there for 25 years. It's just at its 25th anniversary. Before that, we had ferries. And we still have a ferry on another part of the island that only operates in the summertime. You can take the ferry, you can take the bridge, you can take a swim. Some people swim there. It's a good challenge swimming across the strait or fly. So in Eastern Canada, we have a lot of older people. It's a part of the world. So some of these bars on the left-hand side are the part of the country that I'm from. We've historically had a lot of out-migration, so we end up having quite a lot of older people. We also have a lot of people who left when they were young to seek fame and fortune in the rest of the world, but they come back like salmon and they retire. So we have many reasons why we have a lot of older people in our part of the world. So the Canadian Cohousing Network is a group that defines cohousing as neighbors that combine the autonomy of private dwellings with the advantage of shared resources and community living. So that's probably no surprise to any of you, but I am focused on talking about cohousing. There are some eco-villages in Canada, and some co-housing communities could also be eco-villages as well, but I'm going to specifically focus on co-housing communities and organizations that are part of the Canadian Cohousing Network. Canada is a large country geographically. This network only has 20, I checked a few days ago, it only lists 20 communities, co-housing communities that are completed. There's tons more in formation and in development, and some of those will open at some point, but that is not very many, and that's kind of an important thing to think about. This is not very common in Canada, unfortunately. However, and it's quite unevenly distributed. So in yellow, I didn't put each community, but British Columbia is here on the West Coast, and there's 15 in British Columbia alone. There's one in Alberta, 3 in Manitoba, 1 in Ottawa, Ontario, on the Quebec-Ontario border, which is our capital, and that's it. The one that's imminent that I know of is on the southern shore of Nova Scotia and Bridgewater that will be opening this fall. So as I said, there's lots of others that are in development, and that's kind of what I'll talk a little bit about today. But it certainly has been a challenge in many ways, getting these communities established in Canada. So we did a study a little while ago. This wasn't specifically about COVID, but I just wanted to share just really briefly some of the challenges that have been faced around establishing these communities in Eastern Canada in particular, because there's none right now in Eastern Canada. I should say too that there could certainly be some communities that aren't members of the Canadian Cohousing Network. Certainly, there could be some of those. So these are just some of the reasons that we identified that it is difficult to establish co-housing communities in the Maritime provinces. So this is just a really quick summary of some of the things that we identified. It can be really difficult when you're the first one and there's none other in the province. And sometimes when things happen far away on the West Coast in British Columbia, that's not exactly a good example for people who live thousands of miles away. It's almost like an entirely different, it is a very different place and a different culture. So it's difficult to be the first ones to establish. In where I'm from, there's more familiarity with single family dwellings and rental units, individual rental units, and that's pretty much it in terms of that. It's one of the reasons why I was so happy to come to this conference and get to participate in the tours and see all of the different ways of living that aren't very common where I come from. We identified something called East Coast culture. We're not even sure exactly what that means, but people told us there was an East Coast culture. Possibly in Canada, that means pretty traditional, I guess I would say, in general. Some people told us in that study that we already have strong communities, and I do understand what they mean, because I am from a small place, a small village, where people know each other, where there's often very large extended networks of family and friends that do help and support each other. So we have community, and some people said we don't need to recreate that. We don't need to have an intentional community because we have community. There's also quite a lot of public spaces available, community halls and schools and such things that in a lot of cases operate kind of like a common house really for these small communities. The financial piece is really challenging. And then other issues we identified, which are not unusual for those of you who've been involved in trying to establish and grow these communities, is finding the right place, the right people, and then just getting people all to agree on things. You know, there was certainly many communities that seemed like they were going to go forward, and just one of these things happened. A location fell through. It kind of burst the bubble, took the energy out of the group, and they disbanded, and that was the problem. One of the first time I probably got involved in co-housing was when there was a local group in Prince Edward Island who knew that I studied things around housing and seniors, and they were really excited about developing a co-housing community, and asked me to talk about some of the research. What do we know about these? How do they affect older people and things like that? So I started delving into the literature and did a presentation for them. And I was really hopeful that that community would go forward, but it was really all about finding the place, and they never really did find the place, and they have really quite disbanded since that time. So a lot of challenges, and none of these I don't think are new to any of you here. So I just wonder if I can see my screen a little bit different. I'm sorry. I did this a minute ago, so I could see a little better. Sorry, just the video is there. Okay. The project, though, that I wanted to talk to you about today that was really more about COVID is a two-part study. And I'm not going to talk about the first part, but we have been involved, our research team, in documenting the current state of co-housing in Canada. We are really committed as a team to trying to do what we can to help grow and encourage the development of co-housing communities for those who want to develop them, and really sort of doing a little bit of a baseline of what is in existence today is useful. So it does not sound like huge numbers, but we only know of 20, and we were able to collect a lot of data from 16 of those, really documenting their history, you know, what their characteristics and some of the issues that they have been dealing with. So we're working on that separately. But while we were doing that study, we added a component of also asking people how older adults fared in Canadian co-housing communities during the COVID pandemic. So that's what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about. So we interviewed 13 people, and like others have said, this was just individual people. 2 of them were from one community, but they were 12 different communities. So we didn't get a huge amount of data from each individual community around issues of aging and COVID, and they might not obviously be representative of everyone in that community. So we did this relatively recently from October till January of this year. And in terms of the pandemic in Canada, we didn't have a lot of widespread COVID outbreaks until the Omicron wave. So starting kind of in late 2021 was when we started to have much more widespread COVID in Canada in a lot of places. We had COVID, but there wasn't a huge amount until that time. So the people we talked to were 9 women in total of the 13. 6 of the 13 were 75 or older. Most of them were 60 plus. The ones that were younger than 60 really focused on talking about issues of aging and older adults in their communities. 7 were retired, and 7 lived in co-housing communities for more than 12 years. I don't think we have any that really have been there for 30 or more years. I don't think any of them have been around that long, but some were in these communities quite a few years. The only criteria was that they had been living in a co-housing community since the onset of the COVID pandemic. So we asked them about how COVID-19 affected their community, infection control policies and practices implemented, and specifically around how it affected older adults. So the first theme I wanted to talk briefly about was that we identified in this small qualitative study is that we worked hard to stay connected, and they really did a great job of facilitating social engagement during the pandemic. There was certainly, because of so many social isolation protocols, there was really an increased importance placed on maintaining social connections. And very interestingly, for some people, they felt that social engagement actually increased during the pandemic for people that were inside their community. It was really easy for them to form social bubbles. I'm not sure if they used that language where you were from, but for sometimes people living alone, or they could connect and interact with a small group of people, maybe one other household or something like that. And it was just very easy for them to do that within their co-housing communities. They still found ways to continue to share food together. They organized a lot of outdoor activities and utilized video calls within their community so that they could still have meetings and still connect socially. They talked about eating together virtually. So they would be eating, but they would be all connected together virtually. I'm sure that's happened in lots of other places. The outdoor spaces were extremely important. And it was really fascinating. Again, this is a relatively cold country. Now, some of these communities are in British Columbia, and in the West Coast and Southern British Columbia, the climate is quite temperate. So not quite the snowfall you see where I'm from, covering everything on the East Coast, but still it can be quite cold and damp. They really extensively use those outdoor spaces. I don't have pictures, but some of them talked vividly about things like doing yoga in the snow and such things like that outside. Wouldn't that be interesting? Yoga in the snow. So a quote here was an outdoor COVID, they called it a COVID cafe. That was quite interesting. It became a surprisingly well-used activity. More people showed up for daily coffee and social time than they did before. So it's an example of how social engagement increased, perhaps because they had so few other things that they were allowed to do. So even though in a lot of cases, there wasn't always a lot of COVID cases in their co-housing communities or in the area, there was still a lot of lockdown protocols, and especially very early on in the pandemic. So the second theme was that we really benefited from having people with skills related to COVID. So this one was really interesting, where they talked about all of the different skills that the people in the community had and the ways that they were able to utilize those skills to support the community, perhaps in slightly different ways during the pandemic. So the health professionals, the occupational therapists, nurses and physicians, and other people in the community with specific expertise around food safety or biology research or long-term care or mental health. So they talked about all of these different people and how they were really helpful in being the ones that either formed a new committee or expanded a sort of a health and safety committee that was already in place, or a committee to focus on emergency kind of issues, and how those people were really useful in terms of helping to develop protocols, figuring out how to do things safely where they could continue to do activities, and developing and implementing those protocols. So I didn't want to use quotes from really specific groups because it could potentially be identifying, but there was a lot of nurses. So this quote is about how we actually have 3 nurses here. So they were the initial committee, and then there was one man worked in long-term care who was part of that committee that really contributed their knowledge and expertise specifically to supporting the communities during the COVID pandemic. The third theme, does anyone need anything? Elevated levels of mutual support. I found this one also really very interesting, how, again, we're talking primarily about older adults in our specific areas of interest. And I should probably say that even though our team is primarily made up of people who are focused on aging and focused on older adults, many of these communities were multi-generational, although a few in Canada are specifically senior co-housing communities, but they just had to include seniors to be part of our particular study. It's actually something our team is really very curious about in terms of, and Margaret is really interested in looking at the advantages of multi-generational versus senior-only communities. Her community in Souk, British Columbia, called Harborside, is actually a senior-only community. So those things are really kind of interesting to our team, but they had to include older adults in some ways. So we really found that the participants talked about this increased support that people offered. So for people who had health issues or had to isolate. So this quote is about, there was just this whole community that was out there that I knew would have my back if I became ill. And that gave people a lot of support. So many times for people who are older, they really talked a lot about how they knew other older adults who lived in other kinds of housing situations. We have a huge amount of isolation of seniors in Canada, a lot of older adults who live alone or with possibly one other person who don't have a lot of help and support around them. So not everybody lives in a community like I do in rural places where there is extensive social networks. So it is social isolation is a huge issue for older adults. So they were feeling very good that there was lots of people around them and they didn't experience that kind of isolation that lots of other people did during COVID. The fourth theme was a lot about the design of co-housing communities. And they really spoke a lot about how the physical design was really COVID-friendly design. And I never really heard of COVID-friendly design before. But this is really what they talked about. We didn't know COVID was going to happen. We don't build co-housing communities to deal with a pandemic. But a lot of the aspects of the physical design were really useful during COVID. So the design features that force people to come across each other, where you see each other, walkways are such that you're going to interact with people by design. That was really helpful in reducing isolation. So even if people weren't able to interact closely, they still saw each other. They often had some kind of a deck or a balcony where they could socially distance and see other people, seeing children playing, talk to other people. So that forcing people to interact was really useful during COVID, but still being able to socially isolate and things like that. The guest suites, most of the communities have some sort of guest accommodations, and that was really useful. In some cases, for people who had COVID, they had a place to go in the community. So they sometimes used them for people who had to isolate because they had COVID or were a close contact and just had to separate from other people for a while. So the guest suite or suites were really useful to have that space during COVID. The common houses were used in all kinds of different ways. In some cases, if people had to work at home, they could use the common house or parts of the common house as work from home space. A lot of people talked about how they could still use, sometimes the common houses were locked down and they couldn't use them for group activities, but sometimes they could figure out how to do that in a safe way. The outdoor spaces, as I said, were used extensively in summer and winter in many different ways. Some had parking garages. So, like some buildings have them underground or as a separate structure. So they didn't all have a parking garage, but there was one community in particular where they just used that parking garage so extensively. So they took the cars out, put them somewhere else, and then they just used the parking garage. They called it outdoor space because if they opened whatever doors, and maybe, it was open to the outside anyway in some ways, it was sort of a semi-indoor outdoor space, but they considered it outdoor space in terms of COVID protocols. So it just became a place where kids could play and they could have, community meals. So it was sort of like an extension of the common house, but considered outdoor space. So again, not all have a parking garage of some sort, but that was kind of interesting for how they used those spaces during COVID. So this quote here is about how they calculated their common house space and figured that they could fit 16 people. So that's not everybody in their community, but it's some people. It's more than the people in your own household. So they were able to keep people 2 meters apart, and they could still bring people together in a circle and interact and things like that. So having larger common spaces was really useful for them, whether it was in a common house or a parking garage or outdoor spaces. Some of them modified their outdoor spaces as well, where they would put up some sort of a shelter, whether that was to shelter from the sun in the summer or to keep the snow and ice out in the winter, but kind of putting up canopies or shelters where they could kind of have have more use of the outdoor spaces that they had. There's already been some discussion about vaccination status, so I probably don't need to talk about this too much. I should probably say that we only interviewed people who were fully in favor of vaccination and had been fully vaccinated themselves, but there was definitely a lot of differences of opinion about this, and it caused great consternation within the co-housing communities between those who agreed with vaccination and received vaccinations and those who didn't. So in terms of being able to do things together, it very much fractured relationships and possibly permanently, which was really sad to see. So there were certainly a lot of issues around vaccination status. So in general, we found that for older adults living in a co-housing community during the pandemic was overwhelmingly advantageous for older adults, and lots of examples of how it enhanced their levels of mutual support. And again, when they were talking with us, they often compared themselves or compared older adults in co-housing to not, and how isolated a lot of people were who weren't in a community like this. So it was extremely beneficial for older adults. The vaccination status was a huge issue for several of the communities. I already mentioned a little bit about this. I don't know if it's a dichotomy of communities that want to have older adults only versus multi-generational communities. Quite a few years ago, when I was involved in a large study on seniors housing, we surveyed a lot of older people in our region about what kinds of housing do they want to live in. And one of the questions that we asked was, do you want to live in a place or a building or a community that is all ages or is, just older adults? And there was definitely a diversity of responses in that survey. So some people really wanted to live in a community with older people. Some wanted to live in a community that was multi-generational. So there's never one thing that's going to meet everybody's needs, but there's certainly advantages and disadvantages to both. There unfortunately is currently little opportunity for older adults to live in co-housing in Canada. And as I said, our research team is really hoping that some of the work that we're doing on documenting what currently exists and sharing information about some of the advantages of living in co-housing communities hopefully can provide some evidence for people who are trying to develop and establish these communities in Canada. So just wanted to acknowledge our funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The time our interview participants took to help us, we had research assistants and an advisory group helping us as well. So I think my time is up. Okay, thank you.
We move on with Aaron.
I'm number 5. Oh, it's working. Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for staying up so late. I try to be brief. We have 10 minutes.
Ask it for 10 or 15.
10 or 15.
We can have it.
Okay, so my name is Aharon Ariel Avi. I live in a small village in Israel on the Gaza border. And I'm the founder and director of AKEL, which is a network of international communities in the Jewish world. I'm also one of the founders of McKanan, which is the Israeli local network of communities, which I will say a few words about in a minute. I do not have a slideshow because I was supposed to present tomorrow, which is Shabbat. On Shabbat, as a religious Jew, we do not use computers. And then when I got here, I realized that I will have to use the microphone. So they switched me over to this panel. So I'm just going to read my notes. So first of all, about the context, about the scope, and I'm going to focus more on the responses of movement of communities and less about specific communities per se. So in AKEL comes from the word Kehila, community in Hebrew. We have about 140 communities in 30 different countries and all continents. So that's outside Israel. In Israel, the Makom network, Makom means place in Hebrew, has about 250 communities all over the country. So these are two large movements that interconnect between them. And just to put it in context, I'm not talking about the kibbutz movement. These are young communities, mostly urban communities, like a next new younger generation. There are another 400 kibbutzim, which is a whole different story. There are many sessions about the kibbutzim in this conference. About 85 to 90% of the communities are urban. There are a few eco-villages, rural communities, but most of them are urban in big cities. We have here Deborah Fishman, for example, who leads one of our communities in New York City. Others are in Melbourne, Buenos Aires, London, California, all kinds of large cities. Another thing is that the communities are very diverse. So some communities are huge, some are very small. Just to give you an example, the largest community, intentional community in Israel, in Lod, has more than 1,000 members. They don't have one building. They have a whole neighborhood that they own, that they built from scratch with the schools and kindergartens and all the facilities. And there are tiny communities of 15, 20 people living in a few apartments in a sort of place. They're also diverse in terms of their background. Religious denominations. In Israel, the network includes Jews and non-Jews, ages, all kinds of other factors. And also languages and cultures. As I said, we work in 30 countries, 6 continents, so about 12 different languages in the network. Now, when it comes to the pandemic, so a few things happened. First of all, both of those movements were on a, I think hype is the word. They were like on a, the trend was going up, more communities were being built, the network was expanding, late 2019, early 2020. And then the pandemic hit, which was, I guess, a surprise for everybody. And some communities that were new back then just started to form. They only had like a small core group of 4 or 5 people. They just started to meet. Some of them did not survive. Some of them had just fallen apart. They didn't have enough energy created in in-person circles in order to continue online. I would say that was about 10 to 15% of the communities just dropped out, disappeared. I think one in Brazil also. So it happens. About 65% maintained their level of engagement, membership, activity throughout the tourism pandemic. And the interesting part, I think everything is interesting, but more interesting is that about 15% actually benefited from the pandemic. They actually expanded, got more members. You also heard it from other locations, especially the rural ones. People started, the demand for living outside the city, which you call urban refugees, which I love this term. The demand to live outside the city soared, and then people moved to other communities. Or at least they tried. It wasn't always doable, but the demand rose. Now, from the online perspective, so in Israel, almost nobody knew about Zoom. People were still using Skype. Anyone here remembers Skype? Okay, we're all old enough to remember Skype. Maybe you even remember ICQ and other things. But people didn't know about Zoom. Israel is very small, so it's very easy, relatively easy to meet in person. The entire country is 6 hours drive. Okay, I think that's not even a county in Canada. It's like in Brazil, it's not even a neighborhood. So it's really close. So people used to meet in person. So there was a learning curve. I think people learned how to use the technology, how to utilize it. They learned quickly, but there was a block there. For the diaspora communities in other parts of the world, Zoom was in practice or in use even before that. Because of these distances, because of the global nature of the network, so the transition from in-person to online was relatively easy. Now, in the beginning, I'm going to try and tell the story of what happened in the first few weeks, maybe 2 months. There was even some sort of excitement. I'm putting aside the trauma and the tragedy of the pandemic, focusing now just on the internal communal aspects of that. And it was something new, like how can we do a holiday party or a Shabbat party over Zoom? How can we do play music together on Zoom? You can't, it's terrible, it sounds really awful. We try to play different instruments on Zoom on the same time. But people experimented with those tools and tried to come up with new initiatives. It was kind of fun in the beginning. I'll get in a minute to what happened later. They were able to attract new audiences, especially in places like New York, Melbourne, huge cities, LA. Again, these are cities that are like 30% of the size of Israel. And all of a sudden, people who did not want to drive all the way back and forth to events could actually join events on Zoom. So they got to new audiences, which they could not connect to earlier than that. And as I said, rural communities benefited. Now, it was like a curve, because after the peak, and when people realized, and also at the beginning, it was a long time ago, like 2.5 years ago, but try to remember, I don't know if you identify with this feeling. In the beginning, people thought that COVID is like a few weeks story, 1 month, 2 months. You know, it's going to end by the summer, and no one is even going to remember this ever happened. And it lasted for like 2 years. So nobody, looking back, it's very easy to judge our responses 2 years ago, but in real time, it seemed like this is something new, temporary, it's going to go away, and that's it. When it didn't go away, and when summer came, people who are used to go out and you know, travel together and hike together, I could not do that, because at least in Israel, I think all over the world, the summer of 2020, summer 2020, right? August, July of 2020 was the peak of the pandemic, like very harsh lockdowns. Some places more, like Australia, which had the largest amount of lockdown days in the world, some less, but then people started to actually get a bit more disturbed or anxious about it. We experienced, which I didn't hear you mention this, but I wonder if it was just a phenomenon that we encountered, or if it was also in other parts of the world. But we encountered what we call Zoom fatigue, increasing Zoom fatigue, zoomed out. People just tired of sitting at their desks. And what we learned, and we knew it before, but now we're even more fundamentalist about it, is that you cannot really build a community online. There is no substitute to in-person gatherings. It goes all the way down to our neurology, to pheromones, to hormones, to our informal communication between us as humans. You cannot still, technology cannot mimic that online. It's better than nothing. And for those of you who came of age, like me in the 1990s, just think about going through the pandemic when all you have is a landline phone that costs a ton of money. You can't even talk to people. So of course, going through the pandemic with Zoom was better than going through the pandemic with more primitive technology. But still, it is not a substitute for a community. And I think that that's something that we learned and all of our communities learned. And as the pandemic started to go away, the energy and the motivation to get back into in-person lives or in-person gatherings was higher, because people realized that this is something that cannot be replaced by technology. Now, another aspect of what happened is that these two movements, the one in Israel and then the diaspora, the Jewish world, which are interconnected, most of the communities there are intentional communities, but they also see themselves as what we call kehilot misimatiyot, mission-driven communities. So they care about their own livelihood, of course, but almost every one of the communities has also a mission towards the larger society around it. It can be education, it can be arts and culture, it can be the environment, it can be social justice. Each community in its own context and motivations. But some communities open new schools, they open all kinds of projects which do not serve the community members per se. So it's not only the community members, they serve the entire city or the entire neighborhood in which they live. So when the pandemic hit, many communities pivoted. Some of the projects had to shut down, like if it's social tourism or educational tourism or education in general, they put that on hold. And many of them recruited to national efforts. For example, food deliveries, caring for elders was a very big thing, volunteering to educate or to work with their children or medical staff to give them more time and availability to be in the hospitals. So there was a whole, like the entire movement actually made itself available for the national missions. In Israel, it's very connected to the government, so it was very easy to know where to go and to allocate the resources in an efficient manner. On the other hand, and again, I say it's like a global phenomenon, so it's good just to resonate, compare notes between different parts of the world. We also had our fair amount, or fair share of both COVID deniers, people who said that there is no pandemic, it's a conspiracy, it's even less than a flu, like there's nothing to worry about. And that's something different, anti-vaccinations. So you think that COVID is something serious, but also think that vaccinations are worse than the pandemic. You can think that COVID is nothing, and then there's no reason to get vaccinated. There are different combinations of those worldviews, and it really cut across the board. So left wing, right wing, religious, non-religious, in Israel, outside Israel, it was really all over the world. At least from all the data we have, and again, I'm not showing you a presentation, but from all the data we have, I didn't find like any correlation between personal background, personal status, personal religious beliefs, and the way you treat, or the way you respond or perceive the pandemic and the vaccinations. I think that's a question for future historians. Two more quick points. One, as the pandemic started, again, since we thought it's going to take a short time, we started working with the communities on day one on the exit strategy. So as they were migrating into Zoom, we already started thinking what happens when the pandemic ends and we need to migrate back into in-person lives. It was quasi-successful. Some places it worked better, some don't. As I said, some communities disappeared, and that's just a fact of life. And the last thing I want to say is just to compare it very briefly, and I have 2 more minutes. To compare very briefly to other 2 crises that we've seen those communities face over the last 15 years. One is the 2008 subprime crisis, and the other one is the war in Ukraine in the last 6 months. So very briefly, in 2008, what happened is that, again, since many of our communities have projects that they need to fund somehow, they rely on philanthropy in many cases to fund those projects. And in 2008, many philanthropists lost their assets or became insecure of their financial stability and stopped giving money. The first thing they cut was the philanthropy and social projects, which could happen now with a new collapse in the stock market, but that's a whole different, not a whole different, but that's a contemporary issue. And what we saw in Israel, many nonprofits had to shut down and never recovered from that crisis in 2008. On the other hand, none of the communities shut down. They had to scale down their projects. But Cessna community is a place where you live, where you're connected to people. It's like a family. You don't shut down the community and go somewhere else because you don't have donations anymore. So you just find ways to continue until the financials, until recovery of financial situation. And in Ukraine, that's the last thing I want to say. And I'm putting this just in context because I think there's like a series of crises, and it's interesting to see how communities and networks of communities respond to crises. So we have 5 communities inside Ukraine. I should say we had 3 of them sort of like dissolved in this crisis. The other 2 in Kharkov and Lvov actually became hubs of either taking in IDPs, internally displaced people, like refugees inside the country, delivering food and medication, and also other communities from other parts of the world started mobilizing both volunteers to the borders and donations and all kinds of resources to help. So just the distinction between those 2 crises. So 2008 and the pandemic were global and hit everybody equally, give or take. But in principle, it was everybody experienced it. And then we saw how a network responds in a way that leverages the competitive advantages of communities and what they can do and how they can serve both themselves and others. When it's a more local crisis, like in Ukraine, so the network of communities, and that's an aspect I wanted to bring here, to put here on the table or to share. A network can mobilize its resources and help specifically when it's not when not everybody are hit the same way. So those who are not hit can actually help those who are more severely hit. So with this, we conclude, and maybe we can continue conversation, questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we can hear maybe one or two more questions for Lori and Aaron, if there are, or more open questions or reflections to all of us. We have a little bit more than 5 minutes.
Wait.
Any connection, maybe, other connection you didn't talk about, the intensity of the community, or the level of the sharing characteristics of the, and the reaction toward the pandemic? Any connection in this level?
Not from what you're asking if, like, the more communal the community is, does that impact how they relate to the pandemic and vaccinations? Not from what I see, I didn't see anything like that. There might, what we do see is that where community is more close-knit, the social pressure is more significant. So some people who might be anti-COVID deniers or anti-vaccinations might just be less vocal about it because the social pressure plays its part, but it doesn't, it's a symptom. It doesn't mean that they internally they think differently.
The ability to deal as a community with the social situation. That's, for me, it's more interesting, I think.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I had a very similar question. Maybe I will try. The more intense shared communal life that the community has, the harder it is to deal with it. Did you find that? You know, okay. For example, you know, you've got a co-housing community where people have their own spaces and can choose when to come into those social interactions and when to close that door. Whereas other communities that have much more intense communal life have less private spaces, and therefore it raises more tension because they're present in more communal spaces.
Or have to deal because they're more shared.
I see, okay. So first, just in terms of background, part of diversity is really different models. So some people live in the same house, some people live in the same neighborhood. It varies. But since many of them do work in projects, so that's another aspect of that. So if a community has a project that they need to maintain together and they work closely together, so it's less, so even if they live in different apartments, they still need to maintain a project together. And so it goes both ways. So it's really hard to know. In general, yes, the more you live more closely, they need to deal with those tensions. But I think in some cases it was the other way around. Because if you all live in the same house, you just treat yourself, I think it was a bubble in Canada, that's how you call it. In Israel, we called it, how do you call it? Like pods. Mm. So you're like the same family, so you don't need to isolate or quarantine because you're part of the same family. While if you live in different apartments, then you do need to quarantine and you can't meet. So for Anton, who lives with 100 people in the same building, it might be easier because they could all just isolate as one group, or not.
Is this on? We're involved in our projects outside of ourselves, and so there was a lot of coming and going. So there was no hermetic pod capsule. We were interacting with the outside world every day, and therefore we couldn't become one capsule. We were too big. We're 150 people, so no.
Right, because of the project. Yeah, so it goes both ways.
Can you share with more detail the Mishkaim?
Leftovers.
Leftovers, the problematic leftover COVID in those communities, children, elder people, whatever, in the interaction between inside the community.
Like the long-term impact of
long COVID, yeah.
The long COVID on
psychology,
scars, consequences.
Yeah. You want to share about elderly homes? Or?
Sorry about
the long-term impact of COVID.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not something we really looked at, but I don't know if we know yet really what that impact is going to be in the long term for people who are experiencing the symptoms long time or just in general, what COVID does to us as a society in the long term.
So
Yeah.
the question is social.
I'm not sure. It will be very interesting to see what that will be. I'm not, yeah.
Yeah, I would say that first of all, my profession is I'm an historian. And it's really too close to tell. COVID still haven't ended entirely. There are still pockets of COVID, and the world opened up only like 8 months ago. So it's not enough time. It's here, but it's not. No. It's not enough time to really tell. What I can say from the last 8 months is that communities like recovered or went back to square one very, very quickly, in a positive sense. Like they recovered in-person gatherings, and they were so eager for that. They missed it so much. And the pandemic wasn't all that long. It was a year and a half, 2 years. It wasn't a decade. You forget all the skills. So people came back to it very, very quickly. In most cases. In some cases, for example, communities in South Africa, I just talked to them yesterday in Johannesburg. So they are experiencing difficulties because some of the volunteers who knew what to do, had the skill set, actually moved on. And the new volunteers never experienced the community as it should be before the pandemic. So now they need to teach them the skills again. So there's a learning curve, but right now it seems like people are recovering, socially, people are recovering pretty quickly. It's not like long COVID that I know people have, unfortunately, physically. But again, it might backlash in a year from now. We don't really know.
I will, yeah.
I'll just respond briefly, not on long COVID, but on the psychological impacts. I agree, it's hard to know. There's a huge diversity. Very personally, though, in our community, it was a stressful time, as I think it was for many communities. And actually, one of our residents, our founder, ended up leaving for many issues, but in part, I think what tipped it over the edge was COVID and divergent views within our community. And this has really dramatically changed the nature of our community, our residents, how we think about ourselves. And I think from what we found in our study, that was true. Like some members left, maybe also ideology of the community was a little bit more solidified, where the community acknowledged, okay, we have people who are on both sides of the conversation, or we have, as a community made a decision to, not take it as seriously or to take it more seriously. So I think communities know themselves better now in relation to how they think about vaccines. And then, as I mentioned in the presentation, a lot of online events, online tours, we've seen those things continue and even maybe increase, people using those technologies that they weren't using beforehand.
I think about vaccines. I'm asking you about solitude, about alienation, about loneliness, about those aspects. Vaccines is it comes and goes. It's not something that stays. These things can stay.
Yeah, I'm really sorry, but we have less than 10 minutes for the next session to start. And it's been a long session, so I think we need a break. And we have the part 2 of this session, and I would encourage you to continue the reflections there, because in this one, we had more people presenting, so we will have more space in the second one for reflections, and then we can continue this conversation, because I think it's super important, but we can leave it for tomorrow. Okay. Thank you all for joining us.
Okay, thank you.